So we'll just start off also introducing each other and then the magazine. We're from C Magazine, like we just said, from Toronto, Canada.
Yes, so my lovely co-editor Joy Xiang is a writer born in Shanghai and based in Toronto, where she is editor at C Magazine. She searches for where poetry might meet criticality, might meet the charged liberation of dancing in dark rooms. Her work engages the meeting points of many realities, including desire, migration, material flows, and media nostalgia and futurity.
And Maandeeq, the lovely Maandeeq here. Mohamed is a writer, editor, and researcher living in Toronto, engaging Black studies and related cultural production. She's deeply indebted to the generations of work around Black liberatory politics, poetics, and aesthetics. Currently, Maandeeq is the online and reviews editor at C, as well as a PhD candidate in English and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto.
Thank you.
So to start off, saying a bit about C Magazine, it's a contemporary art and art crit publication that aims to expand conversations about art and its contexts, engaging on a spectrum from local, national to international, social, ethical, and political currents and undercurrents in art. This includes prioritizing historically underrepresented voices. We publish original art writing, new artist projects, experimental texts, reviews, and criticism in its varied forms. And we try to be pluralistic, interdisciplinary, historically engaged, and creative about contributing to a larger web of conversations everywhere about what kind of art is talked about and how, within the potential of art and language to imagine unlimited, more just, and complex realities. So something I think we've been thinking about, and even over the past few days has been in my head. The magazine was founded in 1984. So a lot of people that come to our booths, when they see that, they're like, whoa, that's such a long time. Almost 40 years in existence, which is rare for mags in Canada, but I think all over. But I think it's important to think about what we inherit from those institutions or organizations, even though it still might feel scrappy, or we're like, grant funded and constantly looking for money to fund what we do. So this magazine has seen many changes in its spirit and mandate through the years, beginning with, a small team but a white male editor at the helm. And we've had changeovers in staff in recent years that make this, I think, an opportune moment to think or rethink what C is about, our values editorially and foundationally, and the ways we want to manifest them. I think about who we serve now, what are our communities, who do we want our communities to be through the vehicle of the magazine. Through almost 40 years, that's a lot of different publics, and I think it's okay if some people are not on board with what we do now, but hello. But even without, I don't know, sometimes I still try to get a sense of what our publics are. It's hard to know who's reading unless you directly interact with them. I know there's things like reader surveys or things that we do, but I find a lot of the meaningful connections that wound up happening is, you'll be at a fair or someone from someplace else, not your town, is like, oh, I've heard of C Magazine and I really liked your themes recently or the dialogues that you've commissioned. And I think C has been flexible and scrappy enough to adapt with present moments. So what does that mean for us now? That's a segue into this existential question of art magazines. Like, what is their purpose? What's the purpose of C? And what are our philosophies as editors? There's some recent things informing my thinking, like the workshop we went to yesterday on publishing as an organizing tool with Kimmy Hanauer. And I'd say, and that was in the total landscaping area, and I'd say that was looking at more DIY or anarchist publications toward building solid collective acts or circulating knowledge. And also as someone coming from more zine cultures, it made me think of the purpose of different publications. Like this art magazine feels different. It is inherited. And with that is this inherited responsibility of like, okay, so within Canada, there's not a lot of pubs like this that support artists making work. So first, there's a coverage aspect, like how do we make sure regionally different voices are being heard, and undercovered practices, while also mentoring new writers, because we have an awards program that's called New Critics for emerging writers. And we also try to hold relevant programming. So there's all these different buckets that the magazine is in. So think about how within that can we still hold radical values? What does that even mean? Is that the right question through a vehicle like this? What is this magazine doing? But I do have a sense that a lot of what we do in these incremental, measurable and immeasurable ways is to facilitate connections. So if a writer wants to write about an artist and we commission it, they're interacting. And there's a lot of interactions that come out of that I think will gradually build something bigger that you can't see. And yeah, another, like I've been looking at this book called Track Changes, by Paper Monument, and they talk about the purpose of art criticism now. Also, this isn't an era where we think of art critics or writers as having the final judgment on art. Like for the example in the intro to this, Mira is like, it's more so recognizing that if you have access to a platform with limited space, like that innately holds some power. So the subjects that people choose to write about and how they write about them matters in informing, this cause and effect of who is uplifted or who gets more gallery shows. Because I feel like I've seen some examples in Canada, like, oh, one artist will have a feature and then another publication finds out about them and has an interview, and then a gallery is doing programming, so they recognize, that knowledge has spread and this person would be good for that. So it's this, lineage of the way those things happen. So thinking about how those choices at every step can impact how ideas, opportunities, power, and funding are circulated in the art world, as this intro says. So who tells what stories and who can tell them? And then moving on to the way we think about themes in our magazine, we're published triannually, and we try to think of thematics that are expansive. So like with codes, for example, I'll let Maandeeq, do you want to talk a bit about codes?
Mm-hmm.
Well, starting from this cover image.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, when we put out the call for submissions for codes, one of the things we were really interested in were pitches that would go beyond technology. And so the cover that we settled on, which you can see here, is Elliot Jerome Brown Jr.'s Devon in Red Sox, a 2016 photograph. And it's a photograph that's referenced by Charles Campbell in his review of the As We Rise exhibition in North Vancouver's Polygon Gallery. So because a term like codes already invokes the technological, we had to be careful not to pick technological imagery for the cover when we were reviewing the different options, because we didn't want that to overdetermine reader expectations about the issue, which, as we mentioned, takes up a range of understandings about what a code can be. So to this end, we settled on Devon in Red Sox because right off the bat, you can see that it interrupts some taken for granted visual codes. The image itself has all the hallmarks of a formal photographic composition. You have the bright woody browns and a warm yellow from the lamp, which emphasizes the contrasting colors of the bright white sheets, and a pop of red from the socks. But there's also this tension. There's the charged reds, the hotel room scene, and then at the very center of this tableau, a nude black person, a reference perhaps to visual codes around desire and how images of blackness circulate. So we also have this surprising jolt and stop at the same time because you have this white towel obscuring our gaze as the subject refuses to be hailed. So that moment of disjuncture and of illegibility really gets at the kinds of codes we wanted to explore. in this issue beyond the technological, really. And I think as we edited things throughout the issue, we came to think of another question for us about what it means to produce an issue on codes in this moment. So I would be really curious to hear, Joy, your take on the theme.
Yeah, I mean, as you said about not wanting the idea of codes to be purely about technology, I think thinking about codes within but also beyond the digital imagined realm. Also, as like coding and AI conversations or memes kind of exploded online, but thinking more thoroughly about those as structures and how codes have material effects. They're not just some abstraction, or AI isn't an abstraction. It's based on the material coding, how you make these processes function. So, how can that be extrapolated to how we think about systems of the world? Or, like, when I think of economy, it's a code I still don't fully understand. But what are the things that bring that together? And isn't that as arbitrary as the way people view tarot or astrology? Like, they're just different systems of knowledge and being. So think of codes as these embodied instructions, whether you realize it or not. Or like another example, I often think of like legal policies. No matter how much the language tries to obscure itself, it has very real consequences. Like you think of how Roe versus Wade was overturned in 2022. That was so recent.
Yeah, so when we put out that call for pitches, we were also very intentional, as we said, about not foregrounding technology because there is already a lot of writing, good writing out there on art and technology. And so we were more interested in larger ethical, social, and political codes that underwrite our worlds. So now you could say then that this is an issue on systems or structures, but we specifically settled on codes because of the, and it sounds obvious, of course, to say this, the profound influence of the technological on our life. So at this juncture, to think about structures is also invariably to come up against technology. So to give you a sense of the kind of codes that preoccupied us while making the issue, I found it very helpful to think through the etymology of technology, which comes from the Greek techne, which refers to art, craft, or larger methods of creation, like the invention of contemporary computational tools. This etymology provides a useful conceptual bridge for thinking through the relationship between art and invention, between the cultural and the social. So with this issue on codes, we wanted to see what such acts of invention and reinvention made possible towards more bearable life. And in doing so, we've compiled just a lot of fantastic writing. I know one piece that stuck out to us was a feature by Matt Nish-Lapidus, for instance, who helps us think of codes tied to the practice of art criticism. And I'd love to hear your thinking around your editorial process with that feature, Joy.
Yeah, so for everyone who just joined us, we're C Magazine from Toronto, Canada, contemporary art and art crit publication. We were just talking about what it means to be an art magazine right now and like the publics we serve, the artists we want to uplift who are historically marginalized. And feel free to take a copy. This one is our newest one, the one called Codes, and Gossip was our spring issue. So talking about the issue of codes, there is, so we're thinking of codes beyond the digital imaginary, but also as part of it. There is a feature by Matt Nish-Lapidus, who's an amazing artist, programmer, but he talks about older programming languages. So historicizing our idea of coding now, he talks about this programming language called Logo that was invented in the 60s, and how that was a more personal way of relating to the computer. He talks about creating your own personal micro world. So this program language was built to help you co-learn with the computer, rather than the current like computer industry as commodity, consumer-driven, corporate. So within this language, you could input, like you, as you learned the way the machine understood, you could ask it to draw a square. So for example, you put forward 100 because that's how you make the little, it's called a turtle, go this way. And then if you repeat some instructions, you can build a square. And then you can name all those instructions like square. So then you just go draw square and it recognizes that. So there's a way of co-learning, but the way he talks about it is also programming languages as poetry, where because these earlier ones helped you understand how you could come to define things and manifest it on a screen. Like maybe that might extrapolate to our macro world and larger issues and words like gender, for example, and it allowing this, yeah, shared language of creation, but also agency and how you define those words. Um, in his words, I just wanted to read this passage because I feel like it's succinct, but Matt says, Logo is my intro to the potential of creating a symbolic language all my own, imbued with my values and ways of knowing. Rather than asking me to internalize the functions of the computer as machine, it was code that I could manipulate and recombine into systems that express my inner thoughts, desires, joys, and sorrows. It's kind of humanizing this relation to the computer and realizing it is like a shared tool, rather than now we're kind of under these corporate systems that collect our data. But there have been other conceptions of computers, and those still exist, and I guess in hacker realms now. So from that, I think we can think about what other codes can we recombine or usurp to our purposes. And he also speaks about, oh, this is an example he talks about. It's a Fluxus artist, Alison Knowles. So this is one of the first instances of an artist using computer language to create poetry. So it has a structure you can see: a house of glass in a deserted church using electricity, a house of paper. So the house is the more repeated pattern, and then there's different inputs that go into it afterwards to form what this house is. And another example he uses is Jon Corbett, who's an artist based in Canada. He made a programming language called Cree, and then pound sign. I don't know if that's how you say it, this sign, after the C programming language. But this recognizes that language itself is what holds certain knowledges and worldviews, so it's written in Cree syllabics instead of English, which is the base language of programming, is what it's built on. So in Corbett's words, he says, writing the program in an indigenous language makes the work a story, a cultural product, and a digital reflection of indigenous being, not merely a set of computational instructions. So from that, and the way this, many contributors in this issue interrogate the systems of different worldviews, we also have another feature with an interview with Denise Ferreira da Silva and Valentina Desideri, and Maandeeq can share a bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would have to say that was one of my favorite contributions to this issue. Coco Zhou's interview with Denise Ferreira da Silva and Valentina Desideri. That's an image of their collaborative practice called poetical readings, wherein the pair perform collective tarot and astrological readings, not with the goal of resolving a participant's question, but rather to, and I'll quote one of Desideri's responses in the interview here, create, quote, a sociality through which this question becomes shared. Instead of a conclusive resolution to the posed question, the tools allow for the presence of pain along with anything else, end quote. Then Denise Ferreira da Silva mentions that these readings came to be when they both observed a, quote, certain presentation of the subject that was being constructed during the pandemic because of the subject's lack of self-determination. When we were reading with people, their pain was coming out, alongside their fear, anger, shame, and guilt. The readings engage the pain as something else that is not, as the media captured it, a failed subject, unquote. And towards the end, Zhou sits with how these readings open up to uncertainty, humility, and porosity. I bring up these quotes because I want to think of criticism alongside with other types of reading practices, like astrology and tarot. What opens up when, as critics, we lean into the speculative and the quote unquote dubious? What kinds of new socialities and knowledges can we access when, instead of resolving contradictions in a work or conducting seemingly objective evaluation, we think with or beside a work? So I had these questions in the forefront of my mind when editing this interview.
Yeah, and I think this reminds me of our past issue gossip too, which is more, I guess, the structure of language and oral storytelling focused. But we had feedback, and like people when they think of gossip, it's kind of an ambivalent term or idea. There's like the hot gossip or like gossip of the art world. There's gossip used to protect each other when people talk about whisper networks, or like the way that your labor as a worker can be abused in different art systems, which is, we have a big feature about that in this issue that is anonymized accounts. But thinking about gossip not as something to be taken without question, thinking about the act of questioning itself. So when you're talking about like not being for objective evaluation and resolving contradictions to a work and what does it mean to write alongside it, I think it's about asking questions about the work, and maintaining that curiosity to what, say, like Western Euro logics have considered unverified. Or like if you look at tarot and astrology, like why is what comes out of that experience less legitimized? I think has the potential to create new relations and relating to each other just as much as other systems. It depends on how you use it.
And that's another type of code as well, especially when thought alongside art criticism. So when we think of codes, I was also thinking of the range of discomforted responses that could be elicited by editorial strategies that intentionally commission work by those who are not necessarily talked about in larger publications. So, what are the codes of commissioning and editing? That again, the Track Changes compilation by N+1 just recently came out and highly recommended. It's not uncommon for such political commissioning strategies to be maligned as essentialist or misunderstood as an attempt at inclusion and diversity. But I would like to think that with this issue and based in our past editorial conversations, we were more interested in refusal. But even then, I'm wary of the limits of refusal because this conscious declaration of refusal is still belied by the very existence of, for instance, a set of Western art historical conventions that need to be refused in the first place. And that cements the very center that we would hope to write outside of. So I would like to think that Joy and I aspire to work from a place where the West is not even something I would think about, but how do we even get there? Is that even possible in our context? So I would like to think that art, like many things worthwhile in this world, can help us begin to think about that which is incommensurable or unthinkable but necessary. So given this illegibility, my favorite art writers are the ones that stretch genre and elide the space between life and art, like auto theory, or writing that thinks generously with and alongside an artist. There's a really interesting review in this issue that responds to an installation in verse and poetry. I also think of, for instance, the reviews by Coco Mueller in the 80s and 90s, talking about the Lower East Side and including her own observations of the social scene there. So, is this an autobiography or is this a discussion? of the work. And sorry, I misspoke. Her name was Cookie Mueller. So if we want to know something else about the world, then we really do need to question our fidelity to genre and conventions and codes that govern art criticism. And I think that was one thing that was in our minds.
Yeah, and if you have the issue in front of you, the review that responds in verse is on page 82, but you can see the way it lays out. But just thinking about, yeah, I think often about the purpose of a review too, because I think, part of it is coverage, part of it is writing alongside and hoping to sharpen language alongside the artist's work that the artist might not be working in text about. So how can conversations around it be added to? But I love your point, Maandeeq, about fidelity to genre and what does it mean to be cross-genre. I think a lot about how we can consider form and content together, like a lot of poetry does, or even in the design realm. And how can that container of the text say something about its contents too, like show, but not only tell the refusal of more concrete conventions. And that also touches again on our repeating theme, but on the ways information is received or considered legitimate. How does that work? How do we explode that open? I still believe like new knowledges or something can come from new forms and recombinations of existing forms. Don't know if anything's really new, but yeah, recombinations. And we've had conversations about this too, about how to get to a point to not write or commission from a point where you're always against something, and against a presumed center, as if you are not. And talk about you in a general but also specific sense, like every person's you and positionality is different. Why? Yeah, why do the structurally marginalized? There's different functions of different texts, but to get to a point where we don't always have to feel talking against something. Mm-hmm. Like, what is that space you already occupy and are coming from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Think, at this point, if anybody has any questions or comments, hello. Yeah, I'm thinking about the way we form. So for each theme, we'll put out a call for pitches, and we'll get, the last one had 60 plus pitches, and think about our decision making processes. I think even in those pitches, we try to ask expansive questions like what constitutes a code. But it is also case by case. Like if someone comes back and they're, criticizing a certain form of code or structure, then that is the subject of their text. But I think we look for the ways where it goes deeper into that criticism. So it's not just coverage of, oh, this is an issue, but like, what are the things that make this issue prominent or continuing? And are there other questions you can ask to imagine your way out of that issue? I think it's the other side of, and there's a lot of talk in the art realm about futurisms and different kinds of futurisms in communities, but how do you not get stuck on not being able to imagine a future, which I think is a part of resistance. That's hard among material, emotional, historical realities. So, yeah, like what is text and language's role in that? Can you ask a question on paper, even if it's not unanswered, that can make your brain start to think of different ways out of that issue? So I think we don't. We try to, even in our calls, like ask open-ended questions. Well, having a couple lines basis for how we're approaching the issue, but I think always in an expansive way, codes not as digital codes, but more so, or gossip as not just like, oh, there's good and bad gossip, like the bad being the kind that tears people down, or punitive measures, but like gossip as the questioning itself of truth and who you trust and who is afforded belief. Yeah, so trying to insert things like that or expand on the ways that people might be thinking of the topic and asking open-ended questions. I don't know if that helps or you have a follow-up.
Yeah, and just to speak to that point as well, the past few calls being about gossip, which kind of throws the category of like truth and fact and what's hearsay into crisis, or codes, which really asks us to sit with conventions that govern so much of our life. I think both those calls resulted in a lot of pitches that really challenged my own understanding of what art writing could look like. And we got ranges of responses that I never really have seen before. And so questioning, again, my own fidelity to genre. So I remember when we had the experimental translation collective, who wrote one of the poetic reviews come in. I had to sit with it for a while, and then that process was very illuminating for me because I had to kind of come up against my own limits of what is the function of a review. Is it a response? Is it a conversation? I think those moments are really helpful in kind of doing my own assumptions about what art criticism can look like, and that can help with decentering, for instance, like Western art historical conventions.
Yeah, that reminds me of something, a feature also in the codes issue. This is a image from it, but it's Kaylee Machiko and Mercedes Webb, and they're based in Mohkinstsis, which is Calgary, Alberta. But they have this experimental practice where they use paranormal research technologies. So in this case, they used a spirit box, which flashes through radio signals, and you can pick out word fragments as an experiment of like speaking to the land, because they would sit in this park that's called Confederation Park, named after Canada's Confederation. It's like very manicured, with trees made to line the brook and things like just very set out in a certain way for a certain idea of leisure rather than being with the land as it is. So they experimented with that. In this text, it's laid out with these images, which are infrared photos that they took, and their own reflections against these fragments from this radio, the spirit box. What does that mean to put that together? And you can judge that for yourself as you encounter it. Like, this is open ended. But their aim was to, yeah, decenter this idea of land as inanimate. So, how could you even experiment it with giving it a voice? And they say this is something new that I learned from them, but they call it like a Christian supremacist understanding of ghosts, but Christianity as the form that was tied with coloniality to eradicate indigenous people from the land. But even within that, in a lot of paranormal TV shows, they're trying to get rid of the ghost that's on the property, or like the ghost always has to leave, have to exorcise it or cleanse it. And what does that logic mean when you put it in different other situations? So I thought, yeah, this is really, is it a piece of criticism? Is it an artist project? I think it is cross-genre, but in a way, I mean, I think we're experimenting with a lot and maybe just trying different commissions out and seeing their end process. But it's risks, if you can call it that, that we're pursuing in our attempts
Mm-hmm.
at all of this.
Yes. Do we have any other questions? Well, in that case, I actually have a question for you, Joy, that you posed at the end of your editorial note. You stated really beautifully. You ask, what does it mean to be continually unveiled and recoded?
Yeah, this is. As I'm thinking of the structure of an editorial note and function of that, I feel like I've always found this hard to write. It's only been 2 issues, but of it's like paying tribute to all the amazing features that we have in here. So kind of talking a bit about them, but is that what an editorial note does? Can it do something more? So it's trying to ask these broader questions, but that would encompass all the different ways that these writers think about codes. So in asking what is to be continually unveiled and recoded, yeah, I think I'm also thinking, I mean, just beginning from a personal basis, remembering this feeling of always trying to crack the code of something, or when I was in academia, like I did grad school that was funded, but like trying to crack the language of what academia is and how these structures work. um, or like even something like writing cover letters like from the very material and wrote. um, and I think a way, yeah, and I was talking about the economy, and I still don't really know how that works. So, how does the way that you come into that kinds of knowledge give you power over the thing that confuses you, or some kind of agency in this world where there's a lot of systems that none of us can know the whole of and all of their effects? And I think maybe it's a question of, yeah, that language, that coming into knowing, imaging, and imagining itself. How and why does this thing work the way it is? And even a pet peeve of mine is being annoyed at rules that don't make sense. Like, again, a more mundane example, but in Toronto, everyone drinks in the park, but still not legal to. But I'm like, this thing is already happening. This does not make sense. So yeah, like strategies of figuring out cracking the code in order to X. And that X is the purpose. So figuring out your purpose of cracking the code is one of the questions itself. And I think of all of these as strategies of, yeah, figuring out the world, snaking the grass to lay other foundations. Once you come into that knowledge, sharing it, making some kind of system that is more human or more collective.
Yeah, and I think that's such a really good note for us to wrap up on. So thank you, Joy, and thank you to everyone for coming out to our discussion today. It was such a pleasure to discuss codes with you all, and we're thrilled to launch the issue here at the LA Art Book Fair. You can, if you haven't already, please pick up a copy of our new issue for free here. We're also giving it out at booth Q15, where we'll be all day. And if you're a student, you get a 1 year subscription upon signing up for our newsletter, and we're also including the issue with any new subscription purchase. So thank you again for coming out, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the fair.
Thank you. And we'll be around at the booth too if you want to continue any convos.